get this show on the road. Welcome everybody to part 2 of What It Means to Disagree, featuring the Center for Humanities and Arts Faculty Director Jennifer Ho and the Center of the American West Director Patty Limerick. I'm Kurt Gutjahr, your host, which means I'll be here for about 35 seconds, and then I will disappear from the screen and I'll leave it up to Jennifer and Patty. It's, the conversation we've had leading up to this has been great, and I guarantee you that it will be an entertaining and engaging hour. I just want to give you a couple heads up. There is a Q&A box at the bottom. We have so many questions already laid out that we may not get to them, but we would love still to collect them because we do keep these on record. We are considering continuing this series into next semester. So because it has just been so much fun. It's great to work with Jennifer. And I just want to give everybody a heads up on a couple of events the center has on its calendar. We have an event called Historians Imagine, celebrating the creativity in the craft. And this features Patty Limerick and Yale professor Matt Jacobson in conversation with historians who have taken a particularly creative approach to their work. And oftentimes in scholarship, people don't talk about the role creativity plays in coming up with new ideas and fresh approaches. Our next event for that is on April 14th, featuring Jenny Price from Washington University. Then we have one on May 12th with Phil Deloria from Harvard. And June 19th, Natalia Molina from USC will be joining us. In addition, we have a Bipartisanship and Friendship Happen series. Our next in that is on April 15th, featuring CU President Kennedy and University of Massachusetts President Marty Meehan. They served together in Congress. Kennedy is a Republican, Meehan is a Democrat. So they will have a wide-ranging conversation, and I'm sure they will touch on basically how they've led institutions of higher education during the pandemic. And we just, hot off the presses, have another event in that series. Representative David Skaggs will be in conversation with Colorado Representative Scott McGinnis, their former representatives. We don't even have a date for that. I got the email about probably about 15 minutes ago now. So we are recording this event, just so everybody knows, and it is also on Facebook Live. So if you miss it or if you so enjoy it, you can always come back to our webpage, www.centerwest.org, to stream that or anything else. But without further ado, I will turn it over to Patty and Jennifer.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is one of those interesting, unexpected outcomes of the pandemic that Jennifer and I were in the same workplace, just down the hall from each other, and we had pleasant conversations, but we really never had that many opportunities to dig in on issues. And I do believe that the conversation between us represents the hope for higher education. I'll just say that we are not peas in a pod. We have many areas of disagreement. She's conspicuously young, I will say that. That's a very picture of the differences between us. But we have a number of topics we'd like to get to. And in fact, we have so many that we may do a third or a fourth of these coming up. And I think we should start with the question that this is one that Jennifer presented to us, and it's so much the underpinning for everything else that we will talk about with higher education, the role of professors, doing the right thing by students, having the students do the right thing by us, all that. The underpinning for that is the first question that she put together, and it is so well presented. I'll just say it. It's been 1 year since CU Boulder announced that we'd be sheltering in place, which also coincides with many other universities, business, and municipalities similarly ordering lockdowns. Are either of us surprised at how divisive the pandemic has been?
I have to say yes, unfortunately. Maybe I watched too many films that suggested that when humanity has a common threat, they unite together. So the two films, and this will definitely date me, but both the film Starman and Independence Day, right? So both kind of sci-fi films have this kind of premise that, humanity is at its best when it's at its very worst, right? Like in Independence Day, like humanity comes together and they fight the alien. And similarly, it seems like what we have in common is this threat of this contagion. And, that has thrust us into this global pandemic. And certainly I will say this, like we don't have a chat function, but there's this really wonderful part of This American Life, the podcast, where they talk about this team that came together that had been working on an mRNA vaccine for a different coronavirus. And because of that research, which was a decades in the making, that's what led to the rapid production of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, because they're mRNA vaccines. And, that's really a moment where different people were coming together from around the nation to work on this common vaccine. And they shared their research with the Pfizer people so that Pfizer could also develop their vaccine. But I think, sadly, we've had too few of those kind of working together stories. Instead, we have a lot of confusion about, should you wear masks or shouldn't you wear masks from people?
Well, I would have liked to be answering this question by saying, well, there's really been quite a significant amount of united efforts. And I will say this, that those don't always get press coverage, that the conflicts are just more print ink worthy. And that's been a problem for a long time, that to have a news story, front page, top of the fold, saying, this, speaking old newspaper language here, but people surprisingly congenial at morning meeting, or that's not a headline, although maybe it's getting rare enough to where it could be and should be such a headline. So I do think there's some question about what we are told and what our attention is drawn to. And I mean, I would like to say I'm a person who has never looked with interest at an accident scene and wondered what happened there. I would like to be a person who always just said, well, that is not your business. Whatever has happened there, it's move on. It's not, but I think that's hard to keep from being drawn to stories of calamity and collision. And it seems to have been a mess. Now I'm joining you of just thinking, why did that have to happen? Well, now I'm going to say, sometimes where we are thinking, well, back in this particular era, people really came together. That is sometimes nostalgia speaking. And nostalgia has a very winsome voice, and it keeps us from noticing who was not a part of the unity, or who might have actively opposed it. Then I'm going to go back and say, it's been a mess. And surely there is something, maybe I'm going to go a little nostalgic here, saying in some eras, there have been people called leaders, and who were recognized by maybe a majority of people as leaders, and who auditioned for that and tempered their behavior to come to that. Well, for 4 years in the presidency, we had somebody who led in division. So we would be surprised that having a person empowered as the most powerful figure in the planet was an active force for division, and then we ended up divided. That's a surprise. We were divided before that man became president. So, yeah. And Center of the American West was founded, oh my goodness, we were a little bit fuzzy about when we were founded, but we were founded in the late 1980s. And very soon after we were founded, I began worrying about divisiveness and polarization. So, and in many ways, that's what we existed to do. So I don't know where we would go back to say, well, we were doing better than this. But then that's back to your point, that it's the crisis, it's the sense of a shared threat that brings that unity. And when people are in pretty good shape, a good share of them financially, and things in their own domestic sphere are okay, it's very easy to say, looks good to me. So I think I teeter on the edge of despair, and I get very little consolation for myself or others in saying the set piece of American historians, it was worse just before the Civil War. Worse. Well, that's a real comfort, isn't it? That's really like, okay, that's how to feel better, is with that. So, but I still think that people's, either I have been set up to only be in company on Zoom or wherever with people of goodwill, and some candid camera stunt has been prepared for me, or there really is a very significant percentage of the American population that does have goodwill and would like to be in a common cause and empathetic to each other's dilemmas and so on. They have no flagpole to rally around. Where are they to go to say, the people of good nature trying to do the best? Where is their place to rally?
Well, and that's where I think, I am sort of like a goldfish, right? Where I feel like I am kind of naive about I think because I want it so badly. I want so badly for human beings to rise to their, to their best potential, instead of getting mired in what I see as kind of very superficial, petty differences, right? Which let me just fully recognize that I get that, especially when we're talking about things like religious differences are really entrenched in centuries of faith and belief and politics. And so I'm not trying to say, trying to bridge those kinds of historic divides are easy. But let's just take, let's take the obvious, because I'm a critical race theorist, like let's take race, right? The idea of white supremacy and white superiority in the 21st century seems like, to me, it seems like such a outdated mode of thinking, right? Like who in their right minds would want to say that any race is the superior race? And yet we see a rise in what I call the professional racist class, right? So in other words, we're seeing a rise in the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, as well as neo-Nazis that are espousing, that are making their living literally through divisiveness. Which also strikes me as completely undemocratic, which brings us to January 6th, right? Because I really think that January 6th was another watershed moment in both our pandemic lives and certainly in U.S. democracy, where people are hiding in offices and really worried that they're going to be killed by a mob.
Yeah, and there's, as far as I can see, there's no fudging of that was.
Well, but Patty, there on the extreme conservative right, there is still a belief that it was Antifa, right? As if there is a thing called Antifa, right? So that also, so let's talk about just the whole idea that we have to debate facts, right?
Right. And
that blows my mind.
Right. And now I hope that we're going to get into a very good-natured argument, because one contributing unit of society to the wobbly status of facts, wobbly being an understatement, that was academics. That was academics saying that we must all be alert to perspective and point of view, which we should be, we certainly should be. Postmodernism, we must have that sense of how constructed reality is and so on. So fortunately, I don't think that many people paid attention to academics, but we did put our shoulders to the wheel to say, oh, I wouldn't be so certain of that fact. So my dream, which is not going very well, is that the universities, higher education, would be the place where truth, fact, accuracy regain their standing and somehow then percolate out by some kind of osmosis to the rest of the world. But whatever it is, we would not be complicit in the shaking and rattling of fact. So I'm sure I am smarter in various ways because other academics pursued that more theoretical point of view, and of course, absolutely multiple perspectives and so on. But would you join me in saying that academics have been in part, maybe tiny part, but in part contributors to the rattling of truth?
Well, now we're actually going to be in disagreement because I actually
good move.
No, but not maybe for the reason you think. I don't know that in this case, right? I don't know that the postmodernists, let's just, I'm going to lump them all into a group, were really paid attention to by a public audience, right? So in other words, like in some ways it would be great, right? In some ways it would be great to think that there were a host of people who took college undergraduate classes or even graduate level classes on continental theory and post-structuralism and postmodernism, where they were questioning the nature of truth and talking about multiple perspectives, and that those people then went on to, use this knowledge in the way that they were, talking about counterfactual information, right? Or that there were, what was Kellyanne Conway kind of coined this, right? That there were different types of truths, or there are alternative facts, right? I think that was her popular phrase. But I actually don't, although, and now I'm going to contradict myself, although We are also, so I think no one's going to be surprised by this. I'm definitely positioned on the left. I think some might paint me out to be radical. I'm definitely not a radical because I have friends who are radical and they would be the first to tell you I'm not radical. But my politics are definitely left of center and, very progressive. And I think that obviously people who are right of center are also people, like, I think that on the left, we tend to demonize, right? And we say that people on the right are uneducated, right? Or they're ignorant. When the truth is they went to college, right? Bill O'Reilly went to college, Tucker Carlson went to college. And they took those ideas and they spun them in the way that they are currently spinning them. But I guess I do disagree that I think that academia had a hand in this. I don't know what necessarily to point it to, other than, I guess, and I'll maybe invoke history, right? I'm not a historian, but I'm going to invoke history to the historian, which is to say, the playbook for this is authoritarianism, right? The playbook for there is one kind of way to think about the January 6th insurrection if I'm on the right, and that is that a bunch of people who took on the appearance of Trump supporters were trying to stir up trouble, right? And thus, really, who is at fault is this entity that we're going to call Antifa. But that actually the true patriots who support Donald Trump had nothing to do with the January 6th insurrection because those people believe in democracy. And yet the democracy they believe in is not the democracy that I would recognize.
Quite. And the conspiracy theory thing is out of hand. And the notion that one could say those were the protesters from Portland in different costumes, that's really not working. And I still am going to go one more round of punching out academics for just a second, just to say that one reason why it is hard to correct conspiracy theories, at the very least, we should be able to say, well, look at the word theory. That is different from assertion of fact. When they have a conspiracy theory, that is an idea that could be tested and proven or disproven, but no, it's actually called conspiracy theory, but it's really something else. Anyway, I think we lost some of our authority when we went down the road of saying there are multiple perspectives and reality is constructed. And I would think we would be better set. I don't like having that on our record. It's hard to know how to deal with that. And how do we recant? Do we say, whoops? As I think would be perfectly appropriate to say that got overstated. And I completely yield to your point that there is no real train of causality that says the postmodernists taught classes and then very, very sponge-like, absorptive young people took postmodernism to heart. And that's why we now have a theory that Antifa was, so I totally accept, because of a historian who rejects a very reasoned critique of causality. If I reject that, I shall lose my PhD will be revoked. So I won't be but I still think we could be in a stronger position here and we could be much more aggressive about saying we have ourselves stumbled over the assertion of truth. And we are the ones who, because we have stumbled, are very well set up to say, let's get truth on better footing.
So I guess I struggle with this because on the one hand, there's a part of me that agrees with you, but there's another part that just, I don't want to lose the idea of complexity. And I think, again, this is where the left, and to the degree that the left gets confused with the Democratic Party, right? And so let me be really clear, being left of center is not the same as being a member of the Democratic Party. But I think, we tend to conflate those two things. Same as being right of center doesn't mean that you're part of the Republican Party. And I don't want to lose the sense that there are multiple perspectives to things. I don't want to lose the sense that, and we were talking about this earlier, right? That I can have an opinion based on the things that I know now, and I can write an article or I can, enter into a conversation with you that's going to be recorded for posterity. And then next year I may change my mind, right? So the things I'm saying right now, I actually think maybe a year from now, depending on what's said and done, I might actually have a totally different opinion. And I think that as a human being, I have that right to change my mind. And as a scholar, and here's where I think we get back to academia, right? academics like to think that they know everything, that they're they are literally positioned as the experts. And so we tend to expect that the things that are coming out of our mouths, right? You as a historian, me as a critical race scholar, that the things we're saying are gospel, that they're true and that they're going to be true now and then forever after. But I think the truth that we know now may not be the truth that is going to be what we agree upon a year from now or 5 years from now. And that that's actually part of academia also, right? That's also part of scholarship and research, that there are, like we were talking earlier, Pluto's no longer a planet. I grew up thinking Pluto was a planet. Pluto's no longer a planet. And that's okay, right? Like I may have had Pluto may have been my favorite planet growing up. And it can still be my favorite kind of celestial body in the sky. But I think it's okay that there's new information and Pluto's no longer a planet.
Right. And I think one of the great things that we have out of our conversation a little bit before we got on this is that I think we are onto something really important. Both Jennifer and I agree that the academic world, rather like the rest of the world, has no proper place to admit the change of mind and the recognition of error. So we are going to see, we don't really know if this is going to work because we don't know if we'll have any participants, but we're going to see if we can recruit fellow academics to set an example of participating in a public program where they say, whoops, this is what I got wrong. I was out there, I was asserting this, I was claiming the authority and the gospel of having figured this out, and now, whoops. And I think that would be for the profession very redemptive to have that. And then for humanity, at that point, we'd be setting an example for the rest of the nation. We would really be saying, you can do this, and you can feel better after you've done it, after you've said, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, this wasn't what I am going to stick by. But that we don't really have a place for that to happen. And in the academic world, we certainly don't have that place. And in the rest of the world, there's very hard to get the platform where you will be heard and acknowledged for saying, I changed my mind. And I changed my mind because I recognized I was wrong when I said X or Y. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to find out if we can have, well, Jennifer and I will participate in this program. We don't know if any other academics will join us, but we would be, we'd weep with gratitude if they were to join us on that. I want to come back to the phrase critical race theory and its meaning, but I also want us to take our discussion. We're having, sadly, we're getting really good questions from the audience. We might have to spend a little bit of time with those, but I want to see what happens if we take the questions about higher education that preoccupy us, and we take on the crisis in our own, I would say backyard, but it's really our front yard. So last Saturday night, we had several, maybe 600 or 700, well, nobody was taking a census, so who knows the numbers exactly, but we had many young folks, a good share of whom were CU students, wrecking other people's cars, throwing projectiles at police, circulating around without masks. So that happened, and I could hear the fireworks from, or firecrackers or whatever they were. I could hear that, but I'm 10 blocks away, so I wasn't. My car is in a garage and has not had. But and I try to think about that. I try to think if I were really mad about something, what would make me think I'm going to break someone else's car window? It's just, what could that be? So I do begin to understand that a number of young people feel very constrained in what they thought college life was going to be, given the virus. I see that. But there's also just complete mystery to me about why would that have seemed like the right or a tolerable thing to do. Anyway, so then I think as I watch the university administration try to get some standing or footing to respond to it, I think that's not working. It's a very predictable set of older people saying the young people are behaving badly and they'd better stop. Well, can we do a little, is there some kind of conversation that should be happening? Not one that tolerates the breaking of windows and the throwing rocks. So, and this is the context that we are going to go now take on here, which is that you would think that higher education would be the place where figuring out how older people communicate with younger people and how younger people communicate with older people, you would think this would be the place where the wisdom on that would have accumulated, that universities and colleges would be distinctively set up to say, okay, we've had a breakdown. We've had a breakdown. We know this territory. We know how to have channels of clear communication and remedies, actions that are not just, well, that happened. I guess we'll have to hope it doesn't happen again. So that is my very long-winded way of saying, I don't know what to think about any of this. So I'm going to stop here and say, go, Jennifer, what happened? Why is higher education so unable to take something like this on?
I mean, I'm gonna say my first initial predictable response, being the kind of liberal egghead left of center professor that I am, is that it's neoliberalism. So let me unpack that.
You're gonna, right. I will say that you need to go over that for the audience, but you also probably need to go over it for me, because I'm not 100% certain I have ever gotten on that horse and not been bucked off. So,
okay. So let me first say that, interpersonally, I quite like Phil DiStefano, right? But I also recognize that he's chancellor of this university and that it comes with a host of various hats that he has to wear, as well as responses that he has to give. And I don't know for sure if this is true, because I'm still newish to CU Boulder's culture, but I would tell you, if this had happened at UNC, there is no statement that would have come out of a president's office or a chancellor's office that hadn't been vetted by a legal team. Now, why is that important, right? So in other words, what does Phil DiStefano actually think should happen? I have no idea, right, what the human being Phil DiStefano actually thinks should happen, or any of the senior leadership of CU Boulder. But I know what university leadership needs to be able to say for legal reasons. Mm-hmm. And I know what university leadership needs to say in terms of their relationship with the city of Boulder and the police departments of Boulder, as well as the campus, as well as alumni and homeowners in the area, all of which leads to a not very satisfactory position for anyone, right? So I don't know that anyone was really happy with the statement that was coming out of CU Boulder that Chancellor DiStefano put out. And so should we have figured this out better? I think in many ways academia is better at doing this, but academia is still, like, we're an enterprise that is based on dollars, right? And we get, certainly at CU Boulder, we get very little money from the state government, which means that it's tuition dollars. And particularly my understanding is tuition dollars from out-of-state students. Students who want to come and enjoy the natural beauty and the skiing and other extracurricular academic things, in addition to getting, world-class education from amazing scholars and researchers. But, we have a campus that has a climbing wall and an ice rink. And, I'm certainly not begrudging students having a climbing wall and an ice rink, but I think this speaks volumes about thinking of students as consumers. And so that's the neoliberalism part, right? Thinking of students as consumers rather than thinking about them as students who are learning and figuring things out. And the answer to why break a window is that when your prefrontal cortex hasn't grown in and you're under the age of 26, breaking a window seems like the thing that you should do in the moment, because you are hyped up on a lot of different emotions and potentially other things that you have ingested in your body, right? So certainly I have done many stupid things before my prefrontal cortex grew in. And so I have maybe not sympathy, but an understanding of where that is coming from. So I don't know if that fully captures.
I guess what I should not be taking any pleasure out of this, but the notion that undeveloped prefrontal cortexes and neoliberalism together create a particularly unhappy combination. I hadn't ever thought about that before, and I'm thinking that's kind of that might have got me more engaged with neoliberalism as a theory earlier on if I heard that. I do want to say that I happened to be at the University of Oklahoma a number of years ago when an incident had just occurred. A fraternity group had been on a bus and they were singing songs, and there were recordings made, and they were just ruthlessly denigrating songs to people of color. I happened to go to a conference there, and I got there just as that story was breaking. The president of University of Oklahoma, David Boren, did not speak to the attorneys. He was very angry. Several people, I was coming in on a later plane, but several people from the conference who were there with him at dinner said he left the table. He said, "Oh, we have had a little emergency. We've had a big emergency." He came back and he had said, without a moment's consultation with the attorneys, he came back to the table and he said, "That place will be closed. We're giving them 36 hours, but that fraternity will be closed." And the attorneys were all saying to him, "You can't do that. You shouldn't do that." He said, "I will do that because," and he was on hundreds of press things with that, saying, "I have done everything I can to make this campus welcoming to African-American students. And those young men may have taken it out from under me, but I am not going to let that happen. I'm closing that building." So he did that, and the attorneys were in tizzies, and he stuck by it. He missed our breakfast the next morning because it was before sunrise, and he was out in front of the fraternity with cameras explaining why he was going to shut it down. So that was very interesting, seeing one university president just say, "These are the values we've pursued, and I'm not going to wait for a legal consultation." It seems, I was very pleased to be able to watch that in real time on the place, to think, look at what's happening. But I don't know, would it be appropriate to say that he was jeopardizing his university and risking major financial penalties and much litigation by that? I mean, there must be reasons why people don't go for that stand of principle. I mean, that's one of the great things about, for me, I feel like I'm an armchair quarterback, and that gives me armchair quarterbacks. It's very rare to see an armchair quarterback become the focus of major litigation.
Well, so Patty, there's a question that got posed, and I'm not going to say the name because I think the last time we did that, people may not want to be identified, because I'm not sure if everyone can see the questions. But there's a question about John Eastman. Let's see, where is it?
Yes.
Right. What about CU's response to John Eastman and keeping him in his position and not taking a stronger stance, right? And so I think, and certainly that was a critique I heard again and again about, especially given Eastman's role at the January 6th rally, and his role with, the former Trump administration, or rather maybe, former President Trump. And I think at heart, I'm a pragmatist, right? Which is to say, would I have liked to have seen Eastman removed from campus, given his role, and even earlier, given the op-ed that he wrote for Kamala Harris, and given the fact that he is on the board of a hate group that espouses that marriage can only be between one man and one woman. I don't know that I particularly wanted to see him on campus. I certainly didn't particularly want to think of him teaching students. And I personally wasn't going to be involved in any kind of public debates with him, because, I just felt like sharing space with somebody who I think was not going to recognize my own basic humanity, or question, my citizenship status, because I'm the child of an immigrant from Jamaica and an immigrant from China. Much like Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris. So, but I completely understand why the university did not remove him, because he had a contract, right? This goes back to so, and I know that John Eastman would love nothing better than to have seen CU Boulder enter into a protracted legal case with him, wasting a lot of money and dollars, right? So basically, I think that what the Benson Center is doing in terms of running out the clock of his contract is probably the most expedient thing to signal the irrelevancy of John Eastman. But the symbolism of removing him, I understand, right? That it would have been a very powerful symbol for Chancellor DeStefano to remove him, to signal many different things about the values of CU Boulder. And I think that gets back to, I just want to be really clear about this, because there's some kind of confusion about my invocation of neoliberalism. I certainly am not saying that neoliberalism is an answer or an excuse for anything, but I think it's an explanation for the ways in which capitalism and money drive so many of the decisions that we make, including me, right? Like I am driven by thinking about wanting to have a roof over my head and an income and food to eat. And I have to think about some of those things in terms of the public statements that I'm making. And also the more, when I make certain statements, like, the fact that this is going to be recorded and I'm not sure who's going to be watching this, I also know that I can then get a lot of hate mail or hate texts from people or hate tweets. And yes, that's just speech, but some of it is really uncomfortable, especially when it is saying very rude things about me, let's just say.
Right. And someday, maybe I can make this statement and then we won't be mystified by this anymore. I am amazed that I have gotten so little in the way of pejorative remarks from my fellow citizens. And now that I have said that, maybe that will say to my fellow citizens, let's get her now. So it could be that I'm opening the door on that. But there's something that has always been a little bit mystifying to me on that. And maybe I will have resolved the problem now by saying that. But Denver Post columns and so on, it's just interesting. So that is striking to me. I do want to say that your forthrightness about your own participation in this is great, because I have seen many academics who abhor the market and the workings of the market until they have applied for a job and have gotten a competing offer, and suddenly they are all about the market and what the market value of their own services are, and wanting the university to respond to that market. And it's just, to me, it is pretty hilarious to see people who were just overcome by moral horror of the market until they found a way in which they wanted to use it for themselves. So you didn't do that. You just said, I'm kind of in it. So I'm hoping that that will be a precedent. I want to say, well, actually what I want to do is say first that I couldn't agree with you more, that there is nothing that would have made a person like Eastman happier than being able to claim victim status. That is just a joy to see. I mean, everyone at some point in life has a moment where being a victim is extremely enjoyable and gives you the sense of power that you weren't finding other ways. And any firing of a person like Eastman, that is going to make that person pretty darn happy, because it will give opportunity. So I like that. That he or I keep saying someone like him as if anyone's fooled by that, but it was good that he did not have that chance to claim victimization. And I think he might have had a good cause for saying victimization, because really to say universities offer protection for free speech, but not for him, that is a precarious place for universities to put themselves. So I get that. I want to make sure that we get in here this book, this and ladies and gentlemen, I think this is going to be something that you'll find extremely memorable and worth hearing on this. One of our problems in the United States now is that we have, we are all complicit in some way or another of rather hard and fast categories of identity that we think are there in just unmistakable clarity. So I'm a white person, and other people are not white persons. And this is actually really funny. I was at a conference in Oakland years ago, and they'd just come from a conference. I was with a bunch of K through 12 teachers. They'd come from a conference where a poor panelist was trying to refer to people of color, and then to refer to a person who was not a member of the group people of color. And this poor panelist, speaking rapidly and not thinking ahead, had referred to this individual as a non-person of color, which seemed not great to say non-person, to say basically, well, anyway, so the terminology is quite vexed, and it does become quite an obstacle for communication to have these hard and fast categories of identity. And there are reasons to have them, because certainly you can be scorned as a member of a category that has been imposed on you, and so on. They're very consequential. And so to be able to resist that with the category. Anyway, long-winded way of saying, this is a book by my comrade here, Racial Ambiguity in Asian American Culture. And given our limits in time, I'm just going to say, I want her to talk about the central idea of this book, ambiguity, having multiple meanings at once. Key word that could be enormously valuable in these times if more people could say, oh, it's like Professor Ho said, having many meanings at once, multiple meanings at once. That's what she said. We should think about that. So if it's okay, would you mind there's so many interesting parts here, but just the story of yourself as a case study in racial ambiguity.
Sure. And by the way, I did not pay Patty to say any of this, by the way. So
No.
And in our pre-meeting, I made it clear that we didn't have to talk about my book. But I guess, as I started to really research, and by the way, this book was not meant to be a book on racial ambiguity. It was meant to be a book on passing, racial passing. So the idea that you are one race, but then because of your multiracial status or because you have ambiguous racialized features, you can take on a racial identity that is not quite your own. And I say quite because, let's take someone like Barack Obama, who is the child of a white mother and a Black father. And so if Barack Obama had tried to pass as white, which I know everyone who has seen a picture of Barack Obama, so I'm sure that's everyone who's here, would think that was preposterous, right? How could Barack Obama try to pass as white? But why don't we talk about him being white, right? We talk about him being Black, but we don't talk about him being white. Well, I'm rhetorically asking that. I know the answer to that. I'm sure everyone sort of knows the answer to that because we think we know what being Black looks like, because we have bought into this idea of an optics of race in the United States. And as I was doing research, I was realizing that the term passing was actually too narrow to capture what it is that I was really interested in. And what I was really interested in was sort of broader categories of people who had a racial identity, like had racial feelings about who they were that didn't quite match what society thought that they should be. So multiracial, mixed race people, but also transracial adoptees. And then in my case, and I know I've already referenced this. So my mother is Chinese Jamaican. She was born in Kingston, Jamaica, had a Jamaican passport. I think she still has it because I think you can have dual citizenship. She became a naturalized citizen at some point after moving to the United States and marrying my father, who was a Chinese refugee. So he's a refugee from communist China. And but growing up, I thought of myself as Chinese Jamaican because my mother was Chinese Jamaican. She speaks with a Jamaican accent. She speaks patois. We grew up eating Jamaican food in my house. We grew up listening to reggae music, which I know sounds really stereotypical, but it's just true. And then as I started to learn about what race means, right, when I started to understand that saying the Jamaican part made people have a certain assumption that all Jamaicans are Black, whereas if you are familiar at all with the Caribbean, Jamaica is actually a multiracial space, and there's a sizable Chinese and Indian, South Asian Indian population in Jamaica. And so my grandparents were themselves immigrants from Hong Kong to Jamaica. So I'm not mixed race myself, right? I am not, and I've actually taken a DNA test because I was kind of curious. I was like, I think it's going to come back 100% Chinese, but who knows? And yeah, it's pretty much 100% Chinese. So, but I do have this very strong cultural affiliation with Jamaica. And moreover, when I went to college and, joined like the Asian Student Association, really didn't feel like I had much in common with my fellow Asian American students because I wasn't born into a Chinese immigrant family and thus was grown up speaking, it would have been either Cantonese or Mandarin in my case. And so, just felt really kind of alienated from those stories. And while I may not have a racial ambiguous status, I think it's really clear, again, optically, we would place me as being Asian American. There was also ways in which I didn't fit neatly into this category of what we think who we think Asian Americans are. And I think that's always been, so I've always been interested in the gray. I've always been interested in things that don't fit neatly into boxes, because I think I've never felt like I fit neatly into boxes. And so that's why I started to think about, other people who we might think of as racially ambiguous. Like there's a chapter I have on Tiger Woods. And I think, Tiger Woods is a perfect example of that.
Yeah. So if that got out in a wider adoption, And instead of thinking one identity per person, which is sort of where we are now in our worst national moments, if we said, oh, which of the 4 or 5 identities that I'm encountering here? One of the young folks working with us at the Center of the American West has an excellent book in progress on Mormon Indian people, or Indian Mormon people. And there's a one that, and different tribes, so there's all kinds of complexity in that. So if we just had to say, when we started to make a quick deployment of a category and put that category as a case or cloak over a person, and to say, oh, we better just find out what we're talking about here, or who we're talking about. That seems like it would be really huge. I mean, at least a lot of conversations that were moving fast and heading for rough terrain would have to at least pause. So I am quite enthusiastic about this. And I think certainly with my, well, I have a niece whose mother is white. She's my sister, and whose father was Black. And when my niece was little, it was very common to have people in shopping malls come up to my toddler niece and say, oh, a little lost girl, and start to take her away to find her mother, when her mother, who was white, was right next to her. So I'm very familiar with this sort of, wait, think before you act on that. But it just seems like we would be so redeemed in the clarity with which we draw lines and distinctions if we had your approach in this book, just something that came up before we made an ill thought out generalization. So that's why I like, and I really like the idea that we could actually apply that to professorial identity as well. And here is, this is something I think I didn't really write out, but I just had moments of thinking that the problem with professors in the humanities, maybe especially, I guess, I don't know, trying to reach wider audiences, is that they are very professorial sometimes when they try to go outside the university. And their assumption is, oh, this is going to be like a class, and they will sit in rows and I will speak to them and then have a few questions and then I will depart. And very few professors are actually doing that so much in the sage on the stage thing. But the whole, this is a professor, this is an expert, this is a person with many stripes of accomplishment. People should accept that expertise in a very grateful manner. That has a great paradox, because that custom of the expert, who we would all as general citizens listen to, that was created for older white men. That professor, I know because of my age, I know that was the professor for quite, I don't think I had 2 female professors in college, 1 African-American professor, graduate school, no women professors in my world. Anyway, so I know what that was like. And I know that the ways that we think, oh, this is what a professor is like, that was a design and a custom for older white men. And here's where I'm going to, maybe we can disagree here. I think that an unfortunate thing that has happened is that became this is who a professor is. And that has taken a long time to loosen up. So the claim on expertise, the formal presentation of the self with the degrees, that is from a bunch of older white men in the profession. And all kinds of dynamic things should be happening to change that. So, and yet it is passed on. It is the institutional culture, and it exerts its power. So okay, so how can, do you think there is any degree of nonsense in my theory here? That, I mean, because really I'm basically saying that as a female, I should not have to demand authority in the way that a white male would, but why would I concede that ground? So anyway, so please point out the nonsense in my theory, but if there's any substance in it, that would be interesting too.
Well, I would recouch. I'm going to do the academic thing, right? Which is to say that I would recouch the things that you were saying, Patty, not as nonsense, but really kind of focus on this word power, Because that's, I think, at the end of the day, what we're really talking about when we're talking about any of the various identities that we have, right? So in other words, my identity as a cross-country skier, right? Because I like to cross-country ski, is not necessarily bound into various power dynamics. Or my identity as a homeowner may not necessarily be bound up into certain power dynamics. But we can create situations where we make visible what that power might be. If, for example, I had access to certain cross-country trails based on being a homeowner. So then both of those things are implicated, right? Where I'm now, instead of just, open access space where I can just go cross-country skiing or in, public land. And I think that's the idea of who should have power and how power is created. So I know there's a question in the chat about, specifically to me, about critical race theory. And you had sort of asked that before, right? So I want to be really clear in telling you what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is a discipline. It is a body of knowledge worked on by scholars and researchers who write things that they believe are true in the moment, that I think sometimes they go back years later because our understanding of race is ever evolving, and they may change their idea about what they initially said. So critical race theory does not create division because it is dividing people by race. Critical race theory recognizes that there's a phenomenon of race, much in the same way that I think physicists aren't creating gravity, right? They observe gravity, but they're not actually, by the observation, creating gravity. Although I guess maybe that now we're into philosophical realms of like, if I observe it, then do I create it, right? But we'll table that for another discussion. So I'm not trying to divide people by race. Like, I recognize that technically, if we're talking about race as we talk about species, then we're really only talking about the Homo sapiens of the world, right? As divided by canines or by felines, okay, or crustaceans. So I get that, right? Like, as a human being, I'm a Homo sapien. I am of one race with all of humanity. But race is a social construct, right? Race is created by human beings, and race specifically was created by human beings to divide, and specifically for an economic purpose, which was, in our modern times, to create a division of people so that we could take them from one continent, put them in another continent, enslave them, and then, profit off of that unpaid labor, the transatlantic slave trade. So I think that if we've grown up with centuries of believing that some people by this weird thing that we're going to do, which is divide people up by what we're going to optically call race, and we're going to concentrate that on pigmentation. Although I will say that's not even true, right? Because there are definitely South Asian people who have, I would say, dark pigmented skin who are not considered African American or Black. So again, it kind of points to all of the machinations that we do to try and uphold racial categories that are actually really kind of absurd, right? Like eye shape or texture of hair or, the color of your skin. But this, social construct has been really powerful and is one that we continue to live in, and that continues to govern. Same thing with, gender and sexuality, right? So I think one of the things that I am grateful for, again, as an academic, is I get to debate this in the egghead way that I get to, right? In journal articles and conference presentations, in delightful conversations with a colleague who I know wants us to disagree, but I actually think we probably end up, if not believing the same things, I think we kind of approach things from the same way, which is maximum intellectual curiosity.
So, and I'm going to suggest, I'm going to go a little bit, I don't know what, irritating, I suppose, on this one, but okay, so I can certainly think of ways to reach public audiences that have better forms of engagement and invitation than the term critical race theory. And I am really lucky that history of the American West is thought, oh, history of the American West, well, we'd be interested in hearing that. So, but critical race theory does seem to be a castor oil or bucket of cold water form of inviting an audience. And then I'm going to say, and I know this went by really fast, and you did not do it in any sort of, oh, this is a thing I thought out very carefully. You talked about white supremacists, good, important, and you referred to them as racists. Okay, good. They are that. And then,
although I have a caveat, but go ahead.
Okay, but then the word racist sort of started edging around and became a larger unit of characterizing attitudes based on these optical things. And I thought, I think we need to have more distinctions here, that there is a sense of racial difference that the Proud Boys and Richard Spencer and that they have, and it's not entirely accurate or helpful to get that word racist moving around and taking so many thoughts. And I'm now going to bring into this the 1619 Project, the New York Times famous project, which with complete accuracy says that slavery was present in the origins of the American Republic, and may, by making that statement, obscure that there were also ideals and Quakers and people who had at least profound discomfort with the existence of slavery, who were founders. So that the 1619 accent may actually flatten the complicated and complex story, and also misrepresent the complexity and diversity of things going on in the heads of the founders. And I know that regret that produces, or discomfort with slavery that produces the 3/5 compromise. I know that's not something to say, wasn't that a triumph of the human spirit? No, I get that. So this is very complicated, and you only have a couple minutes here to do this, but more precision in the what is it that we see as a problem?
So let me just say, so first of all, I totally agree with you that, a term like critical race theory is going to be off-putting to a general public. And, just as full disclosure, I've been doing upwards of, I would say, maybe about 30 different webinars and workshops on anti-racism since lockdown, because of the rise of anti-Asian racism. And so usually when people contact me to give a talk, what they're interested in is getting me to talk about anti-Asian racism. And then that allows me to talk about anti-racism and making these terms really clear. So when I talked about the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, they're in the professional class of racists. But I want to be really clear in saying, I actually don't think of racist as an identity category. So in other words, I'm neither racist nor anti-racist. You, Patty, are neither racist or anti-racist. I think some people might assume because you're a white woman, you're a racist. And because I'm a woman of color, I'm an anti-racist. And actually, I don't see that as an identity. I see it in the things that we say and the actions that we do and the beliefs that we hold. So in other words, I have in my lifetime done racist things and said racist things, and I have in my lifetime done anti-racist things and said anti-racist things. And I think I can do and say anti-racist and racist things all the time, right? Because it's a matter of choice of what I am saying, or not even choice, it's just sort of like what I think I believe in the moment. And so what that allows us to do is to make a choice of anti-racism, right? So if we think about it no longer as an identity category, but things that we can say and do to be anti-racist, right? Which is not the same as being not racist. Not racist is just like you're a decent human being. But to be anti-racist is to really understand this larger history. So in terms of the 1619 Project, I'm not a historian, and I'm certainly not a historian of, early colonial America. But, ideals of liberty and equality, do I believe that was applied to everyone? I actually don't. I don't believe that those were ideal. So in other words, I think that they were probably written in good faith to be applied to certain people, white men, white Christian men, to a certain degree, white Christian families, but they were definitely not applied to the indigenous populations that were massacred so that the colonials could take the land, and they definitely weren't applied to the enslaved Black people who were there.
And what terrible folly it would be to say, oh, I don't know where you got that. Of course, the exclusions are sharp and unmistakable. And words got put into text that remain there, and the words have more lives than one. So, okay, so we have a bunch of cool questions. One of the is not a question, but it says, hope you'll have session 3. So that seems good because, oh mercy, there's so many things I would like to get to. I as a Western American historian have things I want to say on some occasion about the history of anti-Asian violence, not just in the West, but much of it in the West. So I want to return to that at some point, but I just want to close with a very short remark about how much I wanted to be a professor and how much I dreamed of the things I might accomplish in that role. And sometimes I think, well, you were a really smart kid, Patty, if that's what you thought. That's what you thought you were going to do. And then sometimes I think, I was a pretty smart kid and I had some of that right. But the dream is looking a little battered from time to time for me, the dream of what it was I was going to do. So could you just say just a couple of words, a few sentences about why you wanted to be a professor, what the dream was that drove that, and how is your dream tattered and as mine is, or what do you think?
I feel like I won the lottery. Like I love I genuinely love what I do. And I will say I didn't start out this way. Like what I thought, I'm a working class kid. I thought just going to college was a big deal. And so grad school seemed totally unattainable. When I found out that you could teach at a community college with a master's degree, I was like, I'm in. And I did a PhD because PhD programs are paid for in the humanities, and master's programs often aren't. And so my wily idea was that I would enter into a PhD program, get the master's degree, and then quit, and then move back to California and teach at a community college. That's really all I ever aspired to do. And so the fact that I get to do what I'm doing here at University of Colorado Boulder and be in conversation with the great Patty Limerick, like that's an amazing trajectory for me.
Well, thank you. And really how great it is to have just a full recognition that if I say, I don't know why we have this custom that was inherited from white men of asserting authority, and there's an edge to that, and you get to just come back at that. It is spectacular to be in a situation where I can say something, and if you choose to find it to be nonsense in part, that's great, and I will learn from that, and I will not go limping from the room thinking, how come she didn't just accept? It's just wonderful. And the notion that we will at some point edge towards a program where we invite people to come join us to say, this is what I think I got wrong.
Yeah, I love that.
Seems like it's not a breath of fresh air. It's just a torrent and current of fresh air coming into not just to the academic world, to the whole country. So Jennifer, this is where I always get to say, standing ovation would only expose how beautiful this shirt is. If I were to stand, you could see the whole thing. So I won't do that, but thank you so much for doing this with me, and let's do session 3.
I have so much fun with you, Patty. And by the way, just so everyone knows, like, I think we only got to maybe 2 questions that we had pre-written.
2.5. And thank you, audience, for joining us. And please be in touch with us. And thank you for your questions, and we'll ponder them more, and we'll figure out a way to just accept that we're only going to do one question, and then we can do your questions too. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.